I'm Ken Jones, and I'm going to do a physical exam. Not a complete physical exam, but I'm going to do a physical exam that includes a bunch of things that frequently you're not used to looking at or thinking about when you do a physical exam. So Liam is 5 years old. He's going to be 6 in the middle of June, and he's been really nice to come here and let me do this exam on him today. So thank you. All right, so I'm going to start off by measuring Liam's head, or his head circumference. Because although the nurse usually will get a head circumference on a child, they don't always do it, and when they do it, they often do it incorrectly. So let me just show you how I do a head circumference. And so you want to make sure that you've given Liam the biggest head you can give him, and so you go from the back right around here like this. Is how I hold the tape, and he's got a head circumference of 52.5 centimeters, which is not a small head, if anything, possibly a relatively large head, with a nice head of hair here. And I then look at his hair whorl, and the hair whorl is back here on the back of his head, and it's always within 3 centimeters anterior to where the posterior fontanelle closed, in a newborn where the posterior fontanelle is, and 3 centimeters anterior to and 3 centimeters to the right or to the left of the midline. And so as you see, looking at Liam here, this would be the midline, and he's just off to the right of the midline. So the posterior parietal hair whorl is a reflection of the underlying brain at about 16 weeks gestation. So it can be very, very helpful to you in terms of giving you an indication as to what his brain, the child's brain, looked like at 16 weeks. And obviously that's an incredibly important bit of information to have. So the way this comes about, or the way we think it comes about, is that the skin on the baby's head is stretched around the developing brain as the brain pushes back in a dome-like fashion between about 14 and 18 weeks gestation. So most of brain growth occurs in that dome-like posterior fashion at that time, and the skin is pulled around that. There's no calvarium in between. The skin is pulled around that, and the hair whorl represents the point of maximum stretch on the skin as the brain pushes back and the skin is stretched around that skin. Now, the vast majority of us, about 97% of us, have a single hair whorl, as does Liam. However, a small percentage of us, about a little less than 3% of us, have 2 posterior parietal hair whorls, and those people are completely normal. We looked at that from the graduating medical school class at the University of Washington in 1973, and about 3% of them had 2 posterior parietal hair whorls, so we are assuming that they were normal. There's a much smaller percentage of people who have 3 posterior parietal hair whorls that are normal, and nobody with no posterior parietal hair whorl is normal in terms of cognitive development. And the obvious reason for that is that there was no growth of the brain posterior at 14 to 18 weeks gestation, and therefore there was no stretch on the skin, and because there was no stretch on the skin as it was pulled around the brain, there is no posterior parietal hair whorl that's formed. So if you want to look for that posterior parietal hair whorl, you want to document how many posterior parietal hair whorls there are on the child, and you want to document the position of the posterior parietal hair whorl. Now I want to look at his ears and demonstrate to you what I look for. The first thing I look for in a 5.5, 6-year-old child is whether there is either a preauricular pit or a preauricular tag, and that's just always occurs just superior to the tragus. The tragus is this structure here, and the preauricular pit or tag occurs right there. And then I look for the configuration of the ear, and Liam's is completely normal in terms of its configuration. Oftentimes you will see that a child has a very prominent median bar that goes right across here, and that's indicative of a number of different disorders, and Liam clearly does not have it. He has a median bar, but it stops right there. What I'm talking about is a median bar that goes all the way across to where my thumb is. And then I look at the back of the ear, because sometimes you see pits over the back of the ear in this area, and that's indicative of Wiedemann-Beckwith syndrome. So I just mentioned that. It's a rare thing, but it's something that it's nice to be aware of, and it occurs sometimes in normal kids as well. So his right ear is totally normal, and his left ear is also completely normal. He's got a little bit more, well, no, he doesn't. His median bar comes across about the same area that on the left as the right. It's not a prominent median bar, and he's got no preauricular pit or tag, and the back of his ear is completely without any kind of pits as well. And we often think about kids that have low-set ears, and so I want to demonstrate to you what a low-set ear is. Many people have thought that what you do to determine a low-set ear is to run a line from the corner of the eye out over the ear, and if the ear is above, then it's not low-set. If the ear is below that line, it's low-set, and that's not helpful at all. So what you need to do is to draw the line. Look up a little bit, that boy, right like that. What you need to do is run a line through the two inner canthi, just like that, and then you need to continue that line, sorry man, around the side of the head, and 20% of the ear should be above that line, as is the case with Liam. So you run you get as your two fixed points the two inner canthi, and then you run that line around the side of the head, and 20% of the ear should be above that line, as is the case with Liam. All right, now I want to look at your eyes, okay? So the eyes can be very, very helpful, just like the hair whorl, in terms of giving us an indication as to the developing brain at an early time in development. And so the most important measurement here is probably the most difficult measurement to make. So this is my ruler. Liam, see this thing? See all those numbers on it?
Yeah.
Okay, and what I'm going to do is measure your eye, but I'm not going to touch your eye at all. So it's not going to hurt you or bother you at all, okay? All right? Yeah. Okay. So the way I do this is to go from the inner canthus to the outer canthus of the eye. And as you see Liam looking right now, it would be very difficult to measure his palpebral fissure because he's not looking up, but now he is looking up. And what you notice is that when he looks up, he uncovers the outer canthus of his eye. And so the fact that he uncovers it allows you to get a good measurement from the inner to the outer canthus of his eye. Now look right there, and you see now that you can't see that outer canthus. So in order to do this accurately, you really have to get the child to look up. So why don't you look up, Liam? And when he looks up, what I do is put the ruler, and I just want to stress the fact that you can't use a paper tape to do this, can't use a cloth tape to do this. You need a solid ruler. It could be plastic. Mine is metal, but anything that's solid works. So I lay the ruler like that. I lay my hand on the side of his cheek, and then I measure from the inner corner or the inner canthus to the outer canthus, and it's 2.5, 2.6, which is completely normal. Now, I want to say something about how I'm doing this. You'll notice that I am not going horizontal like this. I've got the ruler on an angle. And the reason for that is that the inner canthus is anterior to the outer canthus. And by virtue of that, if I went just like this, I would get a measurement that was inaccurate. And so what I have to do is get it on an angle like this, which is therefore flat against the inner to the outer canthus. It's in the same plane as the inner and outer canthus is. And that's, as I said, 2.5, 2.6, and it's completely normal. So in order to do this, you have to have the ruler in this position, and you have to get the child to raise his eyelids. And the other thing that I find very helpful is that I close my left eye and sight with my right eye when I measure his left eye, and if I'm going to do both eyes, I do his right eye with my left eye. But I generally speaking just do one eye, because I have found that the two eyes are almost always within 1 millimeter of each other. All right, man. Now, let me just say a word about why it is important to measure the palpebral fissure. The palpebral fissure is a dependent structure, and it depends upon the optic vesicle, or the eyeball. So the optic vesicle is an outpouching of the frontal area of the brain. So it comes forward, and it induces the overlying ectoderm to form this palpebral fissure. So if the palpebral fissure is shorter than normal, that's an indication to you that there was something that went on in the frontal area of the brain at an early stage in development that led to a palpebral fissure that was shorter than normal. So when you measure a palpebral fissure, the reason that you're doing it is not just to say what the number is, but you're doing it to determine or to get a suggestion as to whether there was a problem in early frontal brain development. All right, I'm now going to talk about his philtrum. And the philtrum is the area from the base of the columella. This is the columella of the nose. So it's right here at the base of the columella to the vermilion border of the upper lip. And we measure that, and we measure it from right against the right where his columella comes down to the top of his vermilion border, and that's 1.1 centimeter, which is completely normal. And I should say that all of these measurements are available to you. You can look up these measurements and determine whether they are normal or abnormal. This area of the face, so it includes the philtrum from here to here. It includes the alveolar ridge, on which are our 4 incisors, 2 central, 2 lateral incisors. And it includes the primary palate. And the primary palate is a little wedge here of the anterior part of our palate. And that area all comes from the medial nasal processes of the developing brain. So you can see it most dramatically in a baby who has a bilateral cleft lip, because a baby who has a bilateral cleft lip frequently has a cleft of both sides of the primary palate, which is that little wedge right in here of the palate that sort of comes forward. And that's called the premaxilla. Well, that whole area, that entire area, comes from the medial nasal processes of the developing frontal area of the brain. So we start off with our nasal pits, or nasal processes, all the way out here on the side of our head. And then as gestation continues, those nasal processes swing forward, they come together, and our nares are here pretty close to the midline, and this area of our face and the primary palate are all included in that movement of tissue forward. So if there's any problem in any of that area, what you need to think about is, maybe there was some insult to that early frontal area of the brain, and in particular the medial nasal processes of the developing brain. And that could be a genetic problem, it could be an environmental problem, such as the fetal alcohol syndrome, in which, and in both those conditions, both holoprosencephaly, which is a single central ventricle, in both of those conditions, holoprosencephaly and the fetal alcohol syndrome, the philtrum is smooth, and you can see here that Liam has these 2 vertical ridges. And you can see that most dramatically by looking sort of from the side, from about 45 degrees. Because if you look full on, it oftentimes looks like he has a smooth philtrum, but his philtrum has 2 very nice vertical ridges, and I think you can see them if you look and what I'm doing now, looking at it from the side, and you can see that, and you can see the shadows where those in the middle of those two vertical ridges. And then you look at his upper lip, and you can see that his vermilion border has a nice Cupid's bow type of a configuration as well. So the importance here is if a child has a smooth philtrum, just like if he has short palpebral fissures, just like if he has a problem with his hair whorl, you need to think of brain, because all three of those things, if they're altered, give you an indication of an early problem in brain development. All right, now I want to look at Liam's palate, and I want you to open your mouth, man, and stick your tongue way out, and say "ah" really loud. And boy, that is perfect, man. And oftentimes you can stop now, man. Oftentimes you get an uncooperative child, unlike Liam, and it's very, very difficult to document the fact that the child's palate is completely intact, and it's also frequently difficult to make sure that the uvula is intact. And in his case it is, but the importance here is to stress the fact that you really got to look, and if you don't have a child who is as cooperative as is Liam, you've got to use a tongue blade to get back there. And so you've got to decide when to look in a child's throat, down a child's throat. Do you do it early or do you do it late in your exam? And so generally speaking, with a child who is 5 or 6, I do it early in the exam because he generally or she generally knows it's coming. Whereas with a little baby, I do it at the end of the exam because after doing that, the baby is totally uncooperative. All right, the hands can be also very helpful to you, just like the posterior hair whorl, just like the palpebral fissure length, just like the philtrum, in giving you some idea about neurologic development and brain development. And what I'm talking about here is looking at the creases on his palms and looking at the creases in his interphalangeal regions. And as you see here on Liam, who has completely normal crease patterns on his palms and on his fingers, we have, generally speaking, most of us have 3 creases. We have a thenar crease, and that is from this movement, and then we have 2 palmar creases, a proximal and a distal palmar crease, and that's from this movement. And we have 2 creases because the palm is not square. As you notice here, the 4th and 5th metacarpal bones are shorter than the 2nd and the 3rd, and therefore the palm is shaped like that. Now, these creases form at around 8 to 10 weeks gestation, and they form as a function of movement of the hand. So the movement of the hand includes the movement of his thumb, and that leads to the thenar crease, and then the movement of the hand leads to the flexion leads to these 2 creases. Now, you have 2 creases as opposed to 1 crease because your hand is not square. Because your 4th and 5th metacarpal are shorter than your 2nd and 3rd, your palm folds like this, but it also folds like this, and therefore you get 2 creases. So if your 4th and 5th metacarpal are the same length as your 2nd and 3rd metacarpal, your palm is going to fold at 8 to 10 weeks like a door on a hinge, and you're going to get a single crease there. And so kids with Down syndrome in about 40% of cases have a single crease as opposed to these 2 normal creases. But again, it's important to recognize that 3.9% of normal people have a unilateral single crease, and about 0.9% of normal people have bilateral single creases. And he has single creases on neither of his feet, or neither of his hands. The other thing that you can look at is his 5th finger, and what you're looking for there is for something called clinodactyly. Clinodactyly means an incurving of the 5th finger, and the way to really get a good feel for that is if the measurement from the inner part of the finger, this measurement from the 1st and 2nd interphalangeal crease is shorter on this side than on this side, and that would tell you that his little finger is incurved and his little finger is not incurved. So this is called clinodactyly. That's C-L-I-N-O-D-A-C-T-Y-L-Y, or clinodactyly. And I also always look in a child for problems with pronation and supination of the arm. And many people will check for pronation, supination by holding the child's arm out like this, and then they'll go like this. Well, actually, what you're looking at then is his shoulder. So what you need to do to check for pronation, supination is you need to have the arm flexed like this, and then you go like that, and he has completely normal pronation, supination of his arm. So problems with pronation and supination are present in a number of disorders. One of the two disorders that is most common and is most frequent that's associated with problems in pronation, supination is XXY, Klinefelter syndrome, and XYY syndrome are both associated with problems in pronation, supination, and are relatively common disorders. A couple of things about feet. Feet are really unusual structures. And we all frequently have little differences about our feet. But one of the things that is most common is to have syndactyly or fusion, and the syndactyly and fusion occurs between the second and the third toe almost always, and it's usually a normal amount of syndactyly or fusion. So syndactyly is the degree of syndactyly that he has, and you can see that he has a little bit of syndactyly from here to here. So there's a little bit of fusion, but it's less than a third of the distance from the proximal end of the first phalanx to the distal end of the third. So it's less than a third of the distance in him. If it's greater than a third of the distance, so when it's less than a third of the distance, it's called a variation of normal. And when it's more than a third of the distance, it's called a minor malformation, and that's the only thing to be aware of. I want to end here by telling you a little bit about a few measurements that I think it's important for you to know about how to measure, but which you only need to do the measurements in situations where you're ruling out some specific condition such as Marfan syndrome or some skeletal dysplasia to look for disproportion. And so the first thing that I want to tell you about is measuring the span. Because the span is increased relative to the length in certain conditions like Marfan syndrome, like XXY syndrome, like XYY syndrome. So you do the span by having the child stretch his arms out like that. Third finger on one side to the tip of the finger on the other side, going across the chest and having the arms extended. So in the newborn period, the span is decreased relative to the height. So the height is greater than the span in the newborn period. At adolescence, it becomes about 1. And after adolescence, in adulthood, the span is a little bit greater than the height. Now I want to talk about the upper-lower segment ratio. And the upper-lower segment ratio in the newborn period is about 1.8. And it drops at adolescence to 1, and then it goes down to about 0.92, and we end up with an upper-lower segment ratio of 0.94. So in the newborn period, our trunk, or our upper segment, is greater than our lower segment, or our legs, and after adolescence, our legs, our lower segment, is longer than our trunk. And the reason it's so long in the newborn period is primarily because of our head. So you measure an upper-lower segment ratio by measuring the lower segment and then subtracting it from the total height. So the lower segment is measured from the top of the symphysis pubis. So I've got my index finger right at the top of the symphysis pubis, and I go from the top of the symphysis down to the bottom of the foot, and it's 80 or 62 centimeters. We then subtract that from his total height, and that gives us an upper segment. Then we come up with an upper-lower segment ratio, and as I said, his upper-lower segment ratio should be about 1.1, 1.2 probably at this point. The upper-lower segment ratio should not necessarily be a part of one's routine physical examination, any more than a span should be. It's something that you do when you are considering a diagnosis that includes a child who's disproportionate in some way. So, for example, someone with Marfan syndrome has a decreased upper-lower segment ratio, whereas somebody with achondroplasia, a skeletal dysplasia, which is disproportionate, has an increased upper-lower segment ratio. We're going to end with measurements of his hands. And again, this really isn't part of one's routine physical examination, but is something that you need to do when you think maybe his hands are short or his fingers are short or something like that. So you go from the distal flexion crease at the wrist, so that's right there, and you go from there to the tip of the third finger, and you measure that. In him it's 12.5, and then leaving the tape measure exactly as it is, you measure his palm. So you go to the metacarpal phalangeal crease, which is right there, so it's 6.7. So you then subtract 6.7 from the total length, and that gives you the length of his index finger. And then you take his index finger and put it over the total hand length, and you get a percentage. You get the index finger, the length of the index finger, as a percentage of the total hand length, and then you put it on the chart, the normal chart, and you can document and determine, first of all, whether his hands are big or small, and then whether his fingers are increased in length or short, based on the finger as a percentage of the total hand length, and both of those measurements are normal. All right, so that's the end of this physical exam, and obviously I haven't done a complete physical examination on a almost 6-year-old boy. There are obviously a huge number of other things that you want to be looking at, like examination of his heart and a variety of other things, but I've gone over a number of issues on the physical examination that I think are a little bit different, things that generally speaking you're not going to be thinking about, and I think in certain situations you need to be thinking about all these things. Now I want to end by just saying a brief word about minor malformations, and what we've been talking about today are for the most part minor malformations, and I want to tell you why it's important to look at minor malformations. So the reason is that if you see one minor malformation on a physical examination of a child, forget it. If you see 2 minor malformations on a physical examination of a child, forget it. We all have 1 or 2 minor malformations. But if you see 3 or more minor malformations on the physical examination of a child, that indicates to you that there is a markedly increased incidence of a major malformation. And in some studies, it's as high as 90% of children that have 3 or more minor malformations have a major malformation. Now, the major malformation is frequently occult. So it could be something like a renal abnormality that you're not going to be aware of. So the point is, if you do a careful physical exam on a child, looking as I have here at Liam, and you see 3 minor malformations or more, you need to put Liam under a microscope in terms of